Okay, open to you.
Who wants the first question?
Question: do you think the U.S. will attack Iran?
I think there's, I don't sit in the Oval Office, obviously, but there's pretty good evidence, I think, that the Pentagon is strongly against it, that the U.S. intelligence, to the extent that we know anything, is opposed to it. And in fact, it's hard to find anyone in favor of it, except that planning happens to be in the hands of an extremely small, unusually autocratic group of people. There's a kind of a, don't like to use the word, but a sort of a quasi-fascist element in the administration. They want tight control of planning in every respect, secrecy, authoritarian control, and so on. And it's really up to Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, maybe 2 or 3 other people. They might decide to do it. I suspect if they do, the reason will be that they have created such a catastrophe in Iraq. They've created a situation where they can't stay in, they can't get out, and they might just decide that, almost as an act of desperation, to just hit the whole system with a sledgehammer and see what happens. That's, I mean, a man-eating tiger in your backyard is dangerous, but a wounded man-eating tiger in your backyard is a lot more dangerous. And I think that's what we're facing. So I can't predict.
Let me get you to something less political. What do you think about global warming? What do you think about the need to use less oil? And what do you think this is going to do, yes, to global politics?
Well, there's a just overwhelming scientific consensus, not only that global warming is taking place, but that human intervention is accelerating it. And there's also an overwhelming consensus that it could be catastrophic. I mean, it's what's called a nonlinear process. It can reach, it can increase and then come to a point where it just has radically different effects, possibly catastrophic effects. There's debates around the edges, but the consensus is real. And there's no doubt that the use of hydrocarbons accelerates it significantly. And yes, there should be a very concerted effort to follow the near unanimous advice of the international scientific community and move significantly towards conservation, towards renewable fuels, towards modifying social and economic arrangements so as to reduce the intensity of the focus on hydrocarbons. And remember, a lot of this is just social engineering, and it's not an economic necessity. So probably the most extraordinary social engineering project maybe in history took place in the United States in the late 40s and 1950s to try to destroy the quite efficient electrical transportation system and replace it by trains. Don't have to tell you, the U.S. has one of the worst rail systems in the industrial world, and that's all planned. It was planned very carefully, and to try the effort to shift the economy to reliance on oil, automobiles, trucks, airplanes, and so on, hydrocarbon-consuming economy. That led to big social effects. It led to suburbanization of the country, to destruction of the inner cities, all kinds of social and cultural changes. And that's not graven in stone. The social engineering projects can be reversed. This was a combination of state and corporate planning. In fact, it was literally a conspiracy, literally. Went to the courts and they charged General Motors, Firestone Rubber, and Standard Oil of California with conspiracy and destroying the Los Angeles public transportation system to try to shift it to oil and cars and so on. I think they were actually fined, if I recall, I think they were fined $5,000, just about enough to pay for the victory dinner afterwards. But, and then the government came in with the National Defense Highway Act. Defense has to be put in any legislation to pass it. The pretext was you have to move missiles around the country or something like that, and so on. Then it went down to state and local levels, which extended the same planning. Well, you know, all of that can be reversed. It's state corporate planning, which can be turned into a sane direction. And the American population is very strongly in favor of it. So, for example, take, say, the Kyoto Protocols. It's not everything, but it's a small step. The population is very strongly in support of them. In fact, so strongly in support that a majority of Bush voters thought that he supported them. Because it's such an obvious thing to support, they thought, well, you know, Bush must support it, which tells you something about how American democracy functions. But there's no doubt that there's a public support, fair degree of public understanding, and it just has to be done, not only here, but everywhere, or the results could be extremely dangerous. What has to be done? Cut.
It's going to impact now, if this really happens, that we reverse this, then how do you see that this changes our whole political system?
Well, I don't think it has to change the political system. I mean, it has to change the political system to become more democratic, but that's for a lot of reasons, so that public opinion enters into public policy. Right now, there's an enormous gulf between public opinion and public policy on a whole range of issues, including this. How to happen, everybody knows. You have to institute energy-saving devices, many of which are already available, and there'll be more with further research. Conservation is a major part of it, and shifting of a general lifestyle so as to reduce reliance on excessive energy consumption. I mean, you know, it's not a law of nature that you have to sit in New York gridlock in New York City in your Hummer or an SUV. You know, those are social and economic policies, and they could be made different. Will that solve the problem? Well, no one knows. It's possible that we're past a tipping point where nothing much can, you know, where maybe you can't stop a serious catastrophe. But one thing is certain: the longer you wait, the less you do, the worse it's going to be. And methods are understood. They're not great secrets.
Mr. Chomsky, you began the briefing mentioning your opinion about the administration's view of what's going on in Iran. What about your view of Iran's aspirations, the government there, the regime? If they end up with a nuclear weapon, how do you feel about that? And also, if you could please comment on the threats that Iran has made toward Israel and other boisterous remarks that have come out of Mr. Ahmadinejad's.
Well, no sane person wants Iran to have nuclear weapons. And there are, but I'll just quote one of Israel's leading military historians, Martin von Crefeld, about a year ago, wrote that, of course, he doesn't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, but he said, after the invasion of Iraq, if Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, they're crazy. The reason is because the invasion of Iraq essentially was an instruction to any potential target in the world that the U.S. is going to attack anyone it likes as long as they're defenseless. So it was an instruction to develop a deterrent. That was pointed out by foreign policy specialists, by academic experts, by intelligence agencies, and so on, who predicted that the invasion of Iraq would lead to an escalation of the threat of terror and proliferation for obvious reasons, which is exactly what happened. How to proceed? Well, there are good ways to proceed. For example, we could take seriously a proposal of Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. A couple of years ago, he made a very sensible proposal, which extends well beyond the Iran case, he proposed that all production of weapons-grade material, enriched uranium that could be used for weapons, should be placed under international supervision. Well, you know, if something like that isn't done, the species is going to blow itself up. Free production of weapons-grade material is going to lead to even accidental destruction. So that's a very sensible proposal. Well, to my knowledge, tell me if you can think of someone else, there's only one country that's accepted that proposal, namely Iran. They said if such a proposal is implemented, fine, they'll be willing to get fissile materials from the International Agency to use for nuclear energy. So that's one step that could be taken. A further step that could be taken is to pursue the agreement that was made between the European Union and Iran 2 years ago. There was an agreement reached. Iran agreed to temporarily suspend all uranium enrichment while agreeing that it's legal. It's their legal right. Everyone agrees to that. So they said they would suspend it if the European Union would provide firm commitments on security issues. Now, security issues is a term that everyone understands. It means the very credible U.S.-Israeli threats to attack Iran, which incidentally are gross violations of the UN Charter, even the threats. So they said, yeah, they would suspend if the European Union would provide firm assurances on security issues. Well, they lived up to their part of the bargain, Iran, but the European Union didn't. Apparently under U.S. pressure, they didn't take any steps towards providing assurances. Well, that continues. No, well, that's something else. Actually, those are mistranslated statements. I mean, they're terrible statements, but what you heard about, you know, Israel must disappear from the world and so on, is just a quotation from Khomeini years ago, saying that in the course of time, Israel should be eliminated.
Actually, we've heard at different conferences and different moments in which President Ahmadinejad has indeed said these things, so I'm a little confused about that.
Well, you don't have to be confused about them,
sir,
because you can read them.
Sir,
you
if
can
you
read,
please
but
answer,
it doesn't make, but it doesn't make any
I
difference.
asked you a couple of questions which you still have not responded to. One is if the Iranian regime ends up with a nuclear weapon, what does that mean in terms of geopolitics, and also what you, sir, think about the threats that have been made to another member state of the United Nations?
Well,
you still haven't answered that question, sir.
I will, and I'll continue to answer it as I have been doing. If you don't want me to go through it, I won't go through it. But there are very sensible steps that can be taken to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, if the U.S. were interested in that. They know the steps that can be taken. They can follow the proposal of Iran in May 2003 to discuss all issues with the United States, including recognition of Israel, acceptance of the Arab League two-state proposal, anything connected with nuclear weapons, security issues in the region. Well, that's a sensible step. The U.S. refused. That was repeated again last January 30th, not the whole package, but a proposal to suspend uranium enrichment if the European Union would provide assurances on security issues. Now, you're right that threats against anyone, including a member of the United Nations, are serious. But by far the most serious threats, because they're also credible, are the threats by the United States and Israel to attack Iran. Those are extremely serious threats. They've been going on for years. The U.S. continues to state, Condoleezza Rice recently, that there will be no security assurances, period. That means the threat of attack remains on the table. That's extremely serious, much more serious than quoting something that Khomeini said will happen in the future course of time, because it's a credible threat. And in fact, the U.S. is building up the threat. The U.S. now has forces on all of Iran's borders. It's of course, by far the overwhelming military power in the world. Its Israeli client has air and armored forces that are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the U.S. And the last year or two, the Bush administration has been building them up further by providing them with roughly 100 advanced jet bombers, very openly and publicly advertised as capable of bombing Iran and returning, equipped with what are called special weapons. You can make your own guess as to what that means. That's for the years of Iranian intelligence to make the worst case. So yes, these are extremely credible threats, and they should be ended by security assurances and by further steps, which I can outline if you like, to integrate Iran into the international community and to put a cap on production of fissile materials. Those are steps towards ending the crisis. Suppose Iran does get a nuclear weapon, which the U.S. is driving them to do. As von Crefeld said, they're virtually instructing them to do it. Well, you know, it's a danger. That means that Iran has a deterrent to U.S. attack. And there's no, it's almost inconceivable that Iran would use a nuclear weapon. If they did, they'd be vaporized in 30 seconds if they even prepared to do it. There is a remote threat that they might leak nuclear technology or weapons to others, maybe even at the scale of U.S. ally Pakistan, though that's unlikely. So yes, it's nobody wants Iran or anyone else to develop nuclear weapons. Sure, nobody wants threats against members of the United Nations or anyone else, particularly very serious and very credible threats like those that the U.S. and Israel are making against Iran. That's much more significant than, in the end of days, some country will disappear.
Professor Chomsky, in recent weeks we've seen fighting break out within the occupied territories, Hamas and Fatah, including some gun battles in the streets. And I'd like to hear your take on that. I'd like to know what that means for the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, it's a serious internal conflict. It's not the major issue there, far from the major issue. The most important events that are taking place in the occupied territories are the U.S.-Israeli programs, which are not rhetoric. They're being implemented, programs of annexing the valuable land and the primary resources, including the crucial water resources, breaking up what remains of the West Bank into unviable, pretty much disconnected cantons with big infrastructure projects and the wall and so on, and imprisoning the remnants, totally surrounding them with Israeli-occupied territory. Well, that's really serious. If those U.S.-Israeli programs are implemented, it's the end of Palestine. And that's the major issue that we should be concerned with. That is described in the United States. Almost universally, it's described as a courageous program of withdrawal. It's not a courageous program of withdrawal. It's an outrageous program of annexation, and perhaps the most extreme program that has certainly been implemented or even contemplated. That's really serious. There are internal problems within Palestinian society right now, mainly in Gaza. Gaza has been turned by the occupation into an utter hellhole. It's the main reason why Israel pulled out its few thousand settlers. It's almost unviable. I mean, it's completely surrounded, has no control of its territories. There's huge poverty and unemployment, and there's a big split between the old Fatah and the new Hamas. And yes, it's showing up in military confrontation. We should be asking ourselves, what can we do about it? I mean, I'm not giving advice to the Palestinians. What can we do about it? Well, we can relieve the circumstances in which these confrontations are taking place. I mean, for example, right now, the United States, primarily, Israel too, of course, and to an extent the European Union, are carrying out a really vicious program of trying to starve the Palestinians into submission because they voted in a free election in a way that we don't like. I mean, that should be arousing a storm of protest. well, we can relieve that and help create circumstances in which maybe their existence will be viable. Now, that's not going to end the internal conflict among the Palestinians, but it would mitigate it. And that's a step that can be taken. It should be taken quite apart from the conflict.
Mr. Chomsky, you seem to talk a lot about international law in this book and in other books. There's Security Council Resolution 1559 on Lebanon, which calls on all militias to be disarmed. You recently visited Hezbollah. Can you tell us what you think of Hezbollah in that light, and does it violate the Security Council resolution and international law? And can you tell us what your thoughts
Hezbollah
about
doesn't
Hezbollah?
violate it, but the government of Lebanon does. The government of Lebanon has been unwilling to implement that component of the Security Council resolution. Should they implement it? Well, you know, that's up to the Lebanese. Hezbollah is a major political party in Lebanon. In the south, it has allegedly about 80% support, and the rest of the support is mostly to Amal, which has very similar programs. The polls indicate that a majority of the population does not think that they should disarm, but that's for them to decide. It's for the government of Lebanon. It's up for if you think that the government of Lebanon is violating international law, then convince the Security Council to sanction them.
No, they call on all militias to be disarmed.
That's right. Yes, but militias are not responsive to any more than I am. If the Security Council says that, if Security Council passes a resolution saying that I should move to some other part of the city, I don't have to do it. That's up to. No, because an individual doesn't violate international law. International law is imposed on states, okay? And states can observe international law, or, like the United States and Britain and others, it can radically violate international law. It's up to the people of Lebanon and the government of Lebanon to decide whether they want Hezbollah to disarm.
You say that arms of Hezbollah, such as it said in a UN report recently to Iran and Syria, violate international law.
The states might, if you have credible evidence, just as the United States, just as the United States radically violates international law by providing massive arms to. Yeah, I understand what you want. You want to concentrate on some minor footnote in the whole story, and I suggest that we look at the whole story. All right, turning to your minor footnote, yes, which is natural for someone who accepts and adopts and wants to pursue the policies of powerful states. Turning to that minor footnote, whether Hezbollah should disarm is a matter for the people of Lebanon to decide. They have a semi-democratic government, very sectarian, but it's got democratic forms. And if they decide that Hezbollah should disarm, yes, then it should disarm. Why aren't they doing it? Well, there's a reason. You may not want to think about it, but the Lebanese think about it. The reason is that they know very well that a guerrilla formation in southern Lebanon is the only potential deterrent to yet another US-backed Israeli invasion. There have been 4 US-backed Israeli invasions since 1978, violent and brutal ones. They were finally driven out after 22 years of occupying southern Lebanon in violation of Security Council resolutions, and they're driven out by guerrilla warfare. And the remaining potential for guerrilla warfare is the only deterrent for another invasion. Well, should Lebanon decide that they need a deterrent? No, it's up to them to decide. It's up to them to decide. And if they are violating Security Council resolution, then they should be treated exactly the way the US and Israel are treated when they radically violate Security Council resolutions. So, for example, if you really think that Security Council resolution should be enforced, then I'm with you. But let's take the big case. So, for example, let's start with the UN Charter, which makes it which is the foundation of modern international law, and makes it it calls aggressive war the supreme crime. That's the Nuremberg principle, accepted by the United Nations. Aggression is the supreme international crime, gross violation of the UN Charter. So fine, let's, and remember, the supreme international crime encompasses all the evil that follows, right? That's the Nuremberg decision accepted by the UN. So fine, let's start punishing the serious violators of international law, like the people are sitting in the White House. Yeah, I think international law should be enforced. The major and we can go down for a whole series of other violations. So, for example, I thought the UN resolutions calling for, Security Council resolutions calling for Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon should have been enforced for 22 years. But they weren't, and I'm sure you didn't care about it, or if you did, let me know. That should have been enforced. They finally did withdraw under guerrilla warfare. The separation wall, which is part of the annexation program of the West Bank, has been declared illegal by a unanimous judgment of the World Court, including the U.S. Justice, contrary to what you may believe. If you read his independent declaration, you'll say that he agrees with that. So that's a unanimous declaration of the World Court. You know, that's binding in international law. That should be enforced. Instead, people like us are helping to violate that law by supporting the annexation program and the U.S. and tacitly European Union support for it. So sure, I would like to see all international law enforced, but if we're going to be serious about it, we don't just take some toothpick on a mountain which happens to conform to power interests in the powerful states and say, okay, let's focus on that. What we do is look at the whole picture, start with the serious cases. Then when we get down to the toothpicks on the mountain, we can pay some attention to them. Also, paying some attention to the reasons why probably a majority of the population in Lebanon thinks they need a deterrent.
Professor Chomsky? So this is a little bit different. I'm wondering what your analysis of the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's described as the worst, the most deadly war since World War II, 4 million dead since 1998. So I looked, I mean, I haven't yet read your book, but I looked in the index, I didn't see it, so I'd like to hear that.
You're right, you're perfectly right about the Congo. It's one of the worst, maybe the worst ongoing atrocity in the world. And you're quite right that among many other hideous atrocities in the world, I didn't discuss that one in the book, because that just doesn't happen to be the topic. If someone can, part of the reason why I didn't discuss it is I can't think of a sensible way to do anything about it. If somebody can come up with some sensible proposals that we can implement, yes, let's do it. There is a weak UN force there, and one sensible proposal would be to strengthen it and to give it logistic support and other means to try to dampen down the conflict. But as I'm sure you know, any form of intervention in a complex conflict has to be evaluated very carefully with regard to its consequences. I mean, it's nice to sit on an academic seminar and say, okay, let's go send troops and solve it, but that doesn't work. Sending troops to solve it often exacerbates it. You have to understand the situation, you have to ask what lies behind it, you have to work out the potential consequences of what might happen, and I haven't researched that, and nor has anyone else to my knowledge, and I haven't seen any serious proposal as to what to do about it, other than to strengthen somewhat the UN forces that are there and to try to put pressure on all the countries that are involved in making it worse. Yeah, that all makes sense, but I don't see a lot that we can do about it, which is why I didn't write about it. What I focus on, frankly, is based on a very elementary moral principle. I realize it's almost universally rejected, but I'd still like to reiterate it. Our prime concern should be our own responsibilities. Our prime concern for anybody should be the predictable consequences of your own actions. I mean, it's very convenient and to be self-righteous and to talk about somebody else's crimes. So if you're a Russian commissar in the 1970s, it would be very convenient to concentrate on U.S. crimes. But the important thing to do in Russia was not that. I don't care whether Sakharov said anything about U.S. crimes. What you care is what they're saying about their own society and something they can do about. And the same elementary moral principle applies to us. The focus of our attention should be on what we can do, what we are doing, what are the options for us to try to terminate major crimes in which we're involved, and there are plenty of them, and to mitigate harm and atrocities elsewhere. And there's a lot that we can do. About the Congo, I really don't know.
There's one, if you don't mind, then I'll hand it to, is on corporations. I wonder what, here's an example. There in Somalia right now, it's a truly failed state, and there's an Australian oil company trying to negotiate side deals with warlords. I wonder how you think corporations can be regulated in a world with obviously there's some places where there's no regulation at all, and usually the home regulator is very pro corporations.
As for regulating corporations, there's very little in the way of international law on that. That's mostly, it's mostly the responsibility of the states in which the corporations are technically located. And you're right, there's a very weak regulatory apparatus, and the reasons are not a deep secret. It's that states and corporations are very tightly linked. I mean, to a very large extent, concentrated private power just dominates the state. In fact, even staffs it. So they're very unlikely to regulate it. And it sets the constraints in which state policy is made. Well, that shouldn't be true. There should, again, democratization of societies would reduce that. In fact, in my opinion, corporations are themselves illegitimate. I take a very conservative position on this. As you may know, when the modern corporation was created about a century ago by state intervention, mostly judicial intervention, wasn't no legislation about it. But when corporate law in the current sense was established in the early 20th century by the courts, there were people who bitterly opposed it, namely conservatives. There used to be conservatives in those days. Now the term's around, but not the concept. Conservatives bitterly condemned it as a return to feudalism, which in a way it was, and a form of communism. Now, that was the reaction to the radical revision of corporate law in the United States and elsewhere to grant corporations, collectivist legal entities, the rights of people of flesh and blood. As a major attack against classical liberal principles. And conservatives, meaning classical liberals, were bitterly offended by that. And I think they had a good point. Well, since that time, it's gotten a lot worse. The decisions, if you look through corporate law, it has, I'll talk about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere, major decisions about 80 years ago, 90 years ago, by the courts, determined that corporations are not only persons, but they are necessarily pathological persons. That is, they determined that a corporation, the corporate management must dedicate itself to increasing profit and market share, whatever the effect on anyone. For a corporation to do anything benevolent was determined to be illegal. That was the issue that came up. I'll go through the court case if you like. And that's been fortified by further corporate law, mostly in the courts, not legislation. The corporations are allowed to do something benevolent if the TV cameras are on. So if you're doing it for public relations purposes, yeah, then you're allowed to do something nice. In fact, the courts have gone so far as to advise corporations that they should carry out benign acts, or else, I'm now quoting, an aroused public may discover what you're up to and what the government is up to and take away your privileges. So you better do nice things to prevent an aroused public to find out what's going on. In the recent international trade agreements, which do provide a kind of a framework for corporate behavior, corporations are given rights that go way beyond persons. So if General Motors, let's say, invests in Mexico, they can demand what's called national treatment. They have to be treated like some Mexican mom and pop business. If a Mexican of flesh and blood comes to New York and asks for national treatment, he'll be lucky if he's not sent to Guantanamo. The reason is that private tyrannies, collectivist private tyrannies, legally created entities, are given rights way beyond persons by the so-called trade agreements, which don't have much to do with trade, certainly not with free trade. Well, you know, all of that can be changed. Yeah, a corporation's a private tyranny. A corporation, if you look at its structure, is about as close to the totalitarian model as anything that human beings have created. Control is completely from top down. You can be inserted in the middle somewhere, like junior manager, take orders from the top down. From the top, you hand them down below. At the very bottom, people are allowed to rent themselves to it. It's called getting a job. There's a very weak accountability to the public, extremely weak. And when you get, you know, when the right wing comes into power, like the Reagan administration or the Bush administration, their primary goal is to weaken the regulatory apparatus. So the Reagan administration, for example, essentially informed the corporate world that they were not going to enforce the regulations on business practices. You can read all about it in Business Week, which had good reports about it, and described how, you know, the number of illegal firings of union organizers, I think, tripled, shot up, and other labor abuses shot up, because the government simply said, we're not going to enforce the law, so do what you like. And they did what they liked. So yes, there's a very real question about the legitimacy of the institution in the first place. But insofar as it exists, and again, let me stress, I'm taking a very conservative position on this. That is the position, was the position of conservatives when they did really exist, with justice. So that's a serious question. But if they exist, yeah, they should be accountable to the public. And that means in many respects. For example, there's no, you know, it's not a law of nature that they should work for the benefit of shareholders. Shareholders doesn't mean somebody who has $5 in a mutual fund. Corporate ownership is very highly concentrated. The top 1% of the population probably holds about half of it. So there's no law that says that they should, I mean, there happens to be a law, but there shouldn't be one, not a justifiable law that says that they should work for the benefit of the tiny percentage of the population that happens to own the country. Why not for what are called stakeholders, meaning the community, the workforce, future generations because of the effects they have on environment and so on. Yeah, those are reasonable proposals, and there's no reason why a democratic society should enforce them.
Professor Chomsky, how do you see the future of Balkans? And do you see any difference between approach of this administration and the previous one? And how that would play in the geostrategic view of the creating of new Europe, as somebody said in the administration without naming names?
I think that this administration is pursuing roughly the same policies as the preceding one. You know, circumstances change, so policies change. They basically just want to keep the Balkans quiet, don't bother us. As long as the Balkans are quiet, not bothering us, integrating themselves into the US-dominated system, then it's fine, do whatever you like. In fact, we now have interesting information from the highest level of the Clinton administration. Strobe Talbott, who was one of the top planners in the Strobe Talbott, who was the head of the state Pentagon Joint Planning Group at the time of the Kosovo War. He was deputy in the State Department. He was designated to be in charge of the joint state military commission that dealt with negotiations during the Kosovo War. He just wrote the introduction to an interesting book by his I think, subordinate who was in charge of communications, John Norris. And in the book, in the introduction, Strobe Talbott says, this is the book you should read if you want to know how we in the Clinton administration understood the bombing of Serbia at the highest level. Says this is the authoritative account. All right, take a look at the book, and you find that Norris says, can't quote the exact words, but something like this. He said that the fundamental reason for the bombing of Serbia in 1999 was not concern, not humanitarian concern for the plight of Kosovar Albanians. It was because Serbia had not undertaken the appropriate social and economic reforms, meaning it was the one holdout in the region that had not accepted the sort of Washington consensus type programs. Well, you know, part of that was already obvious. I mean, if there's massive evidence from the State Department, NATO, OSCE, and others, which shows the British parliamentary inquiry, which shows just overwhelmingly that concern over the humanitarian concern was lacking. They knew perfectly well. There was a ugly level of atrocities, pretty low level, kind of shared between the government and the guerrillas. Maybe actually the British government thought it was mostly guerrillas. But they understood that when they were undertaking the bombing, that was going to escalate the atrocities sharply. In fact, that's even clear from the Milosevic indictment made during the bombing. If you take a look at the indictment, it refers with a single exception to crimes committed after the bombing. Yeah, that's consistent with what was reported in great detail by the OSCE and the State Department and others. So it was clear all along that a humanitarian concern could have been, at most, very marginal. But it's interesting to hear a confirmation from the highest level of the Clinton administration, not only that that's true, but that the real reason was unwillingness to accept the social and economic reforms, as they're called, roughly neoliberal programs. So, and I think that was the policy of the Clinton administration, not only there but elsewhere, and it continues to be the policy of the Bush administration. I mean, there are new issues coming up, like what to do about Kosovo, for example. It's a new issue. Well, you know, I can tell you my own opinion, but I don't know what their planning is. They haven't said. But I think a not unreasonable answer is one that was proposed by the president of Serbia in I think 1993, Kosic, I think his name was. He proposed, and I think that's probably what's going to happen ultimately, that Kosovo should be partitioned with the mostly, at that time, mostly Serbian part. Most of the Serbs have been driven out, but at that time, mostly Serbian part assimilated to Serbia, and the mostly Albanian part either independent if they want or probably assimilated to Albania. My guess is that sooner or later his proposal from 1993 is, or some version of it, is what's going to be implemented. But I haven't seen any policy statement from the Bush administration on this.
Mr. Mr. Chomsky, since Kofi Annan's term will be expired within less than 6 months, how do you evaluate his years? And what was the, if there is, what was the great achievement he could make, and what was the failure or misjudgment he made? And you mentioned about what we call the high-level panel report in your book. Is there any way this organization could be revitalized in the era which, you know, major countries doesn't care about the rule of law or international law?
The high-level report from, I think it was December 2004, was a very sensible document, in my opinion. It included leading Western figures like Gareth Evans, Brent Scowcroft, and others, and a sampling from the rest of the world. And their proposals, I thought, were pretty sensible, particularly their proposal, their conclusion that Article 51 of the Charter should not be revised or rewritten, that it stands appropriately today and it should remain the core of international law. Well, the consequences of that, they didn't have to spell out, but you know them. Yeah, I think that was a proper decision. That's the core of their proposals. As to your question, there's no way of for the UN to function if the great powers simply kick it in the face, which they do. I mean, just take a look at the record of vetoes. I mean, the question of violating Security Council resolutions was brought up before, and they shouldn't be violated. But the most extreme form of violation of a Security Council resolution is to veto it. I mean, you can't, that's the ultimate extreme of violating a Security Council resolution. Well, take a look at the record of vetoes. I mean, in the early years of the United Nations, when the U.S., ran it almost totally just for obvious economic and military reasons, the UN was very popular in the United States. And there was huge denunciation of the Russians for vetoing things. You even had distinguished anthropologists giving psychoanalytic explanations of why the Russians say no all the time, because they were raised in swaddling clothes and that sort of thing. So it was this terrible thing, the Russians are vetoing resolutions. Well, through the 1950s, the UN became, to a limited extent, more representative of the peoples of the world, with decolonization, with the recovery of other industrial societies. By the 1960s, it was not completely under control. So take a look at the record of vetoes since the 1960s. The U.S. is far in the lead on a whole range of issues. Britain is second, and nobody else is even close. Okay, well, as long as that's the case, can't do much. The UN can't do very much, including the Secretary General. He's had some good positions and statements. You can't implement them if the great powers, primarily the United States and Britain, which Britain's leading Journal of International Affairs, Journal of the Royal Institute, described Blair's Britain as the spear carrier for Pax Americana, which is not inaccurate. As long as the one great superpower and its spear carrier dismiss the United Nations and international law, then there's nothing much that the UN can do. And that's, again, a problem that is internal to the great powers. If you take a look at U.S. public opinion, it is overwhelmingly in support of giving a greater, and in fact, leading role to the United Nations international affairs. So an overwhelming majority of Americans think that the UN should take the lead, not the United States, in international conflicts and crises. Since April 2003, I think around 2/3 of the American public has been in favor of keeping U.S. troops in Iraq only under UN supervision. That's essentially what the Italian voters voted, Spanish voters voted for in March 2004. There's even, surprisingly, a small majority that thinks the U.S. should give up the veto and follow the will of the United Nations, even if they don't like the policies. There's strong majorities in favor of increasing funding for UN peacekeeping operations and so on. So if, again, like the global warming question, if public opinion entered into the formation of public policy, well, then the UN would have a much wider latitude to function. If public policy remains divorced from public opinion, that won't be true. If it remains in the hands of concentrations of power that are essentially unaccountable, no, then the UN will be very restricted. I mean, after all, the Bush administration went out of its way to humiliate the United Nations by appointing as its ambassador someone who says, very outspoken, says The United Nations does not exist. If it's an instrument, if it follows the will of the United States, it's fine. Otherwise, we ignore it because international law doesn't apply to us. It's a contract made among states. If one of the states decides not to follow it, that's fine. Of course, doesn't mean if some enemy decides not to follow it, it's fine. It means if we decide not to follow it, it's fine. Well, appointing him as ambassador is a message, a very clear message to the United Nations, not very subtle, and so are the actions. In fact, in the build-up to the Iraq War, the formal Iraq War, we now know that it was already going on. Britain and the United States were already carrying it on in secret, but in the so-called build-up to it in the fall of 2002, Colin Powell and others pointed out to the United Nations that you can either accept the U.S. position or you can become a debating society. Approximately that message. Well, if that's the position of the dominant great power in violation of the will of its own population, then there's a limited range of options open to the United Nations. And that's a problem right here in the United States, secondarily in England, and in fact elsewhere in the world too, but responsibility is distributed roughly relative to power.
Given the situation that it has created in Iraq. Do you
Iran.
think Iran?
Yeah.
Or attack Iran. But given the situation that it has created in Iraq, do you think, in your estimation, Israel at any point in time attack Iran if United States does not? And also the fact that can you also think about a scenario which will ensue if that happens in the Middle East?
Did you ask if Israel attacks Iran?
Yeah, if
Well, I frankly don't think that, I think Israel is much too constrained by its relationship to the United States that it will not carry out military force unless authorized by the United States. I mean, there was a case when Israel did attack a nuclear power, a nuclear development installation, the Osirak bombing in 1981, which was against the will of the United States. And we know what happened that time. The bombing of the Osirak reactor, apparently, as far as we know, initiated Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program. The reactor was investigated shortly after by the chair of the Harvard University Physics Department, who's a specialist in nuclear power and nuclear engineering. He wrote an article in Nature about it, the leading international scientific journal, in which he concluded that this reactor was incapable of producing weapons-grade material or nuclear weapons, and was, in fact, an experimental reactor designed for nuclear power. Well, we also know now from defectors, Iraqi nuclear scientists, who have reported, and it's pretty plausible, that after the Israeli bombing of the reactor, Saddam Hussein ordered the development of nuclear weapons. That's about what you'd expect. It's a typical thing in international affairs. Violence tends to engender violence in response. If the U.S. threats against Iran have almost certainly been a factor in their whatever efforts they're taking to do research and development that might lead to nuclear weapons. Yeah, if threats have that effect, an actual bombing would probably accelerate such actions. As to the effects in the region, they're just, I mean, suppose the U.S. authorized Israel to do it. I mean, the effects in the region would be, I mean, almost indescribable. Nobody can guess. I mean, it might blow up what's left of Iraq. It might lead to, violence all over the region. As I said before, I think the Rumsfeld-Cheney cabal would initiate such efforts either themselves or through Israel only if they're really desperate and they think there's no way out other than just to create chaos and see what happens. No, the question was the 1981 attack authorized by the United States? No, in that case, not. There's pretty good evidence that the United States opposed it at that time. That's one of the rare cases when Israel did something in violation of what the U.S. wanted. And they were slapped down for it right away. I mean, not harshly, but, you know, condemned, and Security Council condemnation and so on. What I said was that as far as we know, the bombing of the Osirak reactor probably initiated Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program.
Hi, I'm Neil Herland with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Over the weekend, a lot of people are aware, there was a sweeping terror arrest, a series of arrests in Canada. More than a dozen suspects were arrested. The Canadian government says it's the first major terror cell in years that they've discovered, the first Islamic terror cell that they found within Canada to such a large degree. The White House is congratulating Canada for being so vigilant. Meanwhile, you have Muslim groups in Canada who are deploring the arrest, saying that it's just racism and that this case is sort of rather flimsy. I'm wondering, what's your take on these arrests, and what advice do you give to Western democracies in terms of dealing with the threat of terror?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, when we use the term terror, we have to recognize that, like most terms of political discourse, it has two meanings. There's a literal meaning, and there's the doctrinal meaning. Now, in the literal meaning, terror is what's described in U.S. Code of Laws. It's the threat or use of violence to intimidate, typically against civilians, to intimidate populations for political, ideological, and other ends. Well, nobody can use that definition, because if you use that definition, it follows instantly that the United States is a leading terrorist state, that Britain is another leading terrorist state, and so on. So the literal definition, the one that's in the U.S. Code of Laws, is unusable. Then we go to the doctrinal definition, the one that's used in the media and scholarship and so on. That's the same as the official definition, but with a condition, a qualification. It only applies to what they do to us, not what we do to them. Okay, that's the doctrinal meaning. I'll now use it in the doctrinal sense, though that's totally dishonest, of course. So in the particular case of the Canadian case, I have no judgment. I don't know what the evidence is against the people they picked up, so I can't say. Nothing's been published, so I have no judgment. As to what to do about the threat of terror in the doctrinal sense, meaning the terror by them against us, there are a lot of things to do. One thing is to not increase the threat. That's a simple step. Don't act in order to increase the threat. Now, the U.S. consistently, and Britain, act in order to increase the threat of terror. Not because they want terror, but because it's just not a high priority. So take the invasion of Iraq. As I mentioned, that was undertaken with the expectation, since amply confirmed, that it would increase the threat of terror. They expected it. It happened. Well, one of the ways not to increase the threat of terror is not to take steps like that that'll increase it. Another, and just about unanimity on this in the among specialists and intelligence agencies. Second step is to try to ask what its reasons are. What are the causes of it? And where the causes are grievances that are legitimate grievances, something should be done about those grievances, quite apart from the threat of terror. It's another way to reduce it. We have, but well, let me get to Canada. First of all, in the case of Canada, it may turn out that the motivation for the terror was Canadian troops in Afghanistan. You might look into that. But whatever it is, if there are grievances, then something should be done. Beyond that, terror is a police problem. So if you find a terrorist cell, if it's legitimate in Canada, yeah, then you should arrest the perpetrators, and they should be subjected to trial, just as the leading terrorists should be, like the ones in the White House. But of course, we're doing it only keeping to the doctrinal sense, so it's only them against us. But there's more to do. What should the United States do about this? Well, actually, there is advice given, recommendations, in the 9/11 Commission report. As you recall, there was an official government commission set up over the strong objections of the Bush administration, but they finally had to agree. There was a commission set up that made recommendations on how to decrease the threat of terror in the United States. Well, one of them had to do with Canada. They concluded that a major threat of terror in the United States is the Canadian border. It's a very long border, practically unprotected, very easy to cross, and they recommended that there be a sharp increase in border patrols on the Canadian border. That's their recommendation. Well, how'd the Bush administration respond? It responded by reducing the growth of the border patrol altogether after 9/11 increase in the border patrol reduced, and shifting it from the Canadian border overwhelmingly to the Mexican border. Okay, so I don't remember the numbers, but I think it's about 10-to-1 by now, per mile of surveillance of the Mexican border and the Canadian border. Well, so they're reducing the efforts to defend the United States from the potential threat of terror from Canada. They're reducing that. Again, another illustration of the fact that protection of the population from terror is just not a high priority. Okay, so for the United States, something else that could be done would be to say, follow the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. And there's a lot more. Terror is not coming from nowhere. And what you want to do is, it's easy to stand up on a pedestal and scream Islamofascism and so on and so forth. Maybe that makes you feel good. But if you want to deal with the threat of terror, you'll ask what its sources are and ask how those sources can be dealt with. What we call terrorists see themselves as kind of a vanguard who are trying to organize a constituency to support their long-term demands. Now, their long-term demands, in the case of, say, jihadi-style terror, are pretty clear. And again, there's pretty near unanimity about this in the specialist community. As they put it, their goals are to defend Muslim lands from attack. And they list specific grievances, and the grievances are real. They're trying to mobilize a constituency to join them. There's two ways of dealing with it. One is to ally yourself with Osama bin Laden. That's the way Bush picked. That's why the leading terrorist specialists in the United States, like Michael Scheuer, described Bush as Osama bin Laden's leading ally. Because what he's done is to do exactly what Osama wants, to help the vanguard mobilize the constituency in support of terrorist acts. What is recommended across the board is pay some attention to those reasons, which are real. You can read that in the Defense Science Board recommendations, in academic scholarship and intelligence reports. Pay attention to the grievances. And many of them are real. And they should be dealt with quite apart from the threat of terror. That can reduce the threat of terror. And we know that it works. Take, say, Northern Ireland. Okay, for a long time, the British reaction to terror in Northern Ireland, which was pretty serious, practically blew up the British cabinet, all sorts of things. Their reaction was just to increase the violence. Okay, that's the Bush line. You join with the terrorists and you're their ally. It's exactly what the more militant sectors of the IRA wanted. So you get an escalating terror and repression cycle. Finally, the British got into their heads that they should pay some attention to the grievances that are the source of it. And in fact, they began to do so because the grievances were real. The constituency was being mobilized around real grievances. When they began to do that, the threat of terror declined. Belfast is not utopia, but it's a very different place from, say, when my wife and I visited in 1993, which was a pretty scary place. It's not that anymore. It's much improved, and in fact, the threat of IRA terror has now been very much marginalized by doing the sensible thing, paying attention to the source out of which it grows. And the same is true in this case.
You spoke about terror, really terror everywhere at this moment, especially in the Middle East. Do you think Hamas finally will survive? And then the other questions is, in the Middle East, one country threatened the other one by nuclear and other things. And at this moment, I wonder if you can tell us, the quartet is the quartet that are active, supposed to do something. It's dead or what?
I understood the first question about Hamas, but not the second
Yeah,
one.
I wonder if Hamas will survive, actually. And the second thing about the threat that you spoke about with the countries in the Middle East, one after the other. And if the quartet actually could do anything,
If the quartet.
Quartet is going to do anything finally, or just dead?
Well, as far as Hamas is concerned, I mean, my own feeling it has is that its policies, its announced policies, are completely unacceptable. However, we should be honest enough to recognize that Hamas's policies are more acceptable than those of the United States and Israel. We should be honest enough to recognize that. So just consider the three demands that are made on Hamas, right? One demand is that they recognize Israel. Do the US and Israel recognize Palestine? No, of course not. In fact, they've completely refused for 30 years to respond to an overwhelming international consensus backed by the PLO, Palestinian National Committee, for a two-state settlement. They've rejected it. So they're more extreme than Hamas. The second demand is that they renounce violence. Do the US and Israel renounce violence? Read the newspapers. No, of course, they carry out violence freely, as much as they like. The third demand is that Hamas live up to international obligations. Okay, the crucial one is the so-called Saudi plan, the Arab League decision in 2002 to establish a two-state settlement on the with full normalization on the international border. And the demand on Hamas is they accept that. In fact, the referendum that's coming along is just a repetition of that, if it comes along. Do the US and Israel accept it? No, they flatly reject it. And this is not just rhetoric, they reject it in acts, which is a lot more important than rhetoric. The current annexation program, in the propaganda system here described as a withdrawal program, the current annexation program is a radical violation of those international agreements. Now, that one didn't happen to have the force of law. It was the Arab League. But similar proposals have been coming to the Security Council and the General Assembly since 1976. 1976 is the first time when a resolution came to the Security Council, January 1976, initiated by Syria, backed by the other major Arab states, calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, incorporating the wording of UN 242, but adding a Palestinian state. Well, that's not a Security Council resolution because the U.S. vetoed it. Okay, U.S. vetoed another one in 1980, a similar one. It's been blocking General Assembly resolutions to the same effect ever since, and not only, and there's almost no break in this. And it's not only votes and rhetoric again; it's also actions. So the settlement programs, all illegal. You know, as I said, the World Court unanimously agreed they're in violation of international law, and that any portion of the separation fence wall that's built to defend the settlements is ipso facto illegal, in the words of the U.S. Justice. Yeah, but they're developing that, and that's very serious. You take a look at the map of what they're imposing, it's very serious. So can the quartet do anything? Well, you know, if the U.S. agrees. It's like the UN. The quartet can't do anything unless the U.S. agrees. What the U.S. is now agreeing to is Israeli annexation of the valuable parts of the territories, water resources, breaking it up, and so on. In fact, Bush is the first president who officially authorized it. I mean, it was going on anyway, but became official authorization under Bush. So yes, as long as that proceeds, they can't do anything. Going back to Hamas, as I say, I don't like their positions, but they are more forthcoming and moderate than those of the United States and Israel. And it goes on. Hamas has called a truce, called for a truce, in fact, has been living up to a truce for the last year. And they're calling, their position is they're calling for a long-term truce, maybe an indefinite truce, on the international border, which happens to be in accord with the overwhelming international consensus since 1976 for a political settlement on the international border with maybe minor and mutual modifications, which was the official U.S. position until it departed from the rest of the world on this. They've been calling for a truce on that border, and once a truce is established, for further negotiations for a permanent settlement. Okay, it's not an unreasonable position. You know, I mean, they continue to claim that the Palestinians have a historic right to the entire former Palestine, but so does Ehud Olmert. He says Jews have a historic right to the entire land of Palestine, and nothing can ever cause us to abandon that right. His foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, comes from a sector of Israeli politics, as far as I know, the Likud background. As far as I know, they've never abandoned their official position that Israel has a right to both sides of the Jordan, meaning to former Palestine and Jordan. Maybe they've abandoned it, I've never seen it, but okay, so if that's what they want to say, fine. I mean, maybe, I think it would be plausible for Mexicans to say that they are not abandoning their right to the roughly half of Mexico that was conquered by the United States in the U.S.-Mexican War. Why should they abandon that right? Of course, they're not going to implement it, but if they wanted to say, well, it's part of our historic right, okay, you know, say it. So that part I don't think is very interesting. The actual programs of Hamas, I think there's a lot to object to, but the programs of the United States and Israel are much worse, and furthermore, they're being implemented. And finally, those are the ones we can do something about. I mean, I can't do anything about what Hamas decides. I can do a lot, or we should do a lot, about what the major countries decide. So fine, let's try to shift U.S.-Israeli policy towards the long-standing international consensus repeated in the Arab League proposals of 2002, accepted by the Palestinians back in December 1988 formally, and continuing right till today. And there are serious proposals right on the table, which are not perfect, but a basis for settlement. The most well-known is the Geneva Accord, released in Geneva in December 2002. This was an informal but quite high-level agreement between Palestinian and Israeli negotiators with a detailed plan for how to reach a settlement based on the international border with mutual modifications, not an unreasonable plan. A lot of support in both Israel and Palestine. Israel rejected it. The U.S. simply dismissed it. And since the U.S. dismissed it, you take a look at U.S. press coverage, they just ridiculed it. So Elaine Shalino had a report in the New York Times about it, in which something like, you know, these unelected people made a derisory report or something like that. Yeah, the reason is because the U.S. dismissed it. Well, if the U.S. dismisses it, nothing's going to happen. Actually, going back to the roadmap, if you take a look, try Google, you'll find it quickly. The Israeli government accepted the roadmap with 14 reservations. Take a look at those 14 reservations. I mean, they eviscerated it, and the U.S. backed them on that. So Israel never accepted the roadmap. But the U.S. backed it, so therefore they go ahead and do what they want, and the press doesn't report it. But again, those are decisions and choices that can be made right here, and should be. What'll happen to Hamas in the long run? I don't know. I mean, they have a lot of popular support, undoubtedly, but there's overwhelming popular support within the Palestinian territories for something like the international consensus, two-state settlement on the international border of the kind that the PLO formally accepted in December 1988. I mean, we might remember what happened then. You know, the people who hold the clubs dislike history. For them, history's bunk. You know, it's antiquated, boring, let's go on. The people who are beaten by the clubs generally think that history is important, and it is. And people who want to understand the world should be with the victims on this. Yes, history is important. You can understand why the powerful want to kick it in the dustbin, but we shouldn't. So what happened when the Palestinian National Council accepted a two-state settlement, basically the international consensus, the overwhelming international consensus, in December 1988? Well, there was a coalition government in Israel, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir coalition government. They came out a few months later, I think it was May '89, with an official statement in which they said there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. The word additional means Jordan is a Palestinian state. So there can be no additional Palestinian state between them. And the fate of the territories will be settled in accord with the guidelines of the State of Israel. Okay, that was their official response to the Palestinian acceptance of the international consensus. What did the U.S. do? This is the Bush #1 administration. The Bush #1 administration reacted by accepting it completely in what's called the Baker Plan, the State Department's Baker Plan, James Baker Plan of December 1989, which endorsed the Israeli government proposal completely. The only reporting of this here that I could find was that they said, the State Department said, well, there should be free elections. There should be free elections in Palestine with most of the educated sector in jail, and the elections should take place only within, the only topic that can come up in the elections is the Israeli plan. There'll be a free election, so that shows we're interested in democracy promotion, and there was a lot of applause to the Bush administration for promoting democracy. See if you can find something else. I mean, as I wrote at the time, and I'll repeat it now, it's as if someone were to propose that there can be no additional Jewish state in the former Palestine, because there already is a Jewish state, namely New York City, where there's a Jewish mayor and, you know, a lot of rich Jews and so on and so forth. And if somebody were to say that, we'd think it's a reversion to Nazism. But when we say it, it's very forthcoming and shows our love of democracy and so on.
Hi there. Professor Chomsky, you've several times referred to the Israeli barrier wall. I've seen the maps of that wall, and goodness knows it's got some funny little squiggles in there, but you don't have it here on your map on page 180. I've certainly never seen this whole corridor straight to the Jordan east of Ma'ale Adumim. How is it you omitted the route of that barrier wall from this map, sir?
Because that's not a route of the barrier wall. That's, if you take a look at the caption, you'll see that that is the Israeli government proposal at Camp David in the year 2000. That's the Israeli government proposal, final proposal at Camp David in the year 2000. I took it from an article by the leading Israeli specialist on the topic, Ron Pundak, who's the Director General of the Paris Foundation on International Peace in Tel Aviv. This happens to be an article in English, which is why I took the map. It's in Survival, the British International Affairs Journal. He and Shaul Arieli, who's one of the top negotiators for Israel, they published a very long article about it, but that one's in Hebrew. So I paraphrased it in the same chapter and, you know, didn't cite it because I can't cite a Hebrew article. I mean, I cited it, but couldn't quote it literally, so I paraphrased it. So yeah, that's a discussion. That is in the context of the discussion of the U.S.-Israeli proposals at Camp David in 2000, which were being hailed as magnanimous and magnificent, and Palestinians don't accept them, shows they're terrible, and so on and so forth. There is discussion, if you read further in the book, of the later maps that are proposed. I didn't actually give the map, but there's a reference there to a long article in Haaretz, which did give a map. If you look it up on Google, it's in Hebrew, you will find the proposed map, I think, as of, I think it's October 2005, but if you look further, you'll see the reference there, and all you have to do is go to the internet and you'll find the map. It's not identical with the proposal in the year 2000, but it's basically the same principle except more extreme, because it not only breaks Palestine occupied territories through the there are two major salients, remember. There's the Ma'ale Adumim salient, the one that goes east of Jerusalem. That's the one that in Pundak's map goes all the way to the Jordan Valley, which Israel's going to keep, as they've announced. So that's one that essentially breaks the southern part from the rest. And there's a second salient that goes through Ariel, the city of Ariel, farther north. And the separation wall now goes around that and farther to the east. And that effectively separates the central ghetto, the enclave, whatever you want to call it, from the northern one. So you get three enclaves. If you have a look at the further implementations of the separation wall, you can find them if you look at the B'Tselem reports, for example. They're all on the internet. You'll see that it also separates all of them from some little corner of East Jerusalem. So it basically breaks the outcome is exactly what I described. I quoted a lot of Israeli and other authorities on the outcome. Meron Ben-Venisti, Harvard University's Sarah Roy, and others. And yeah, that's a description of where the situation stood as of the time that the book went to press. But you can find the maps. The map that I included was in a discussion of the Camp David proposal and the falsification of them here. So I didn't see a single newspaper anywhere which reported the Israeli maps. In fact, I'll tell you something more interesting. It's very hard to do a LexisNexis search for maps. You know, there's no easy way to do that. It takes resources, which I don't have. But nobody in the United States, and a lot of people were looking, could find any map in the press at the time of Camp David. Any map which showed exactly what is being proposed. There was a lot of effusive rhetoric about how forthcoming it is and magnanimous and wonderful. Well, there's an easy way to determine that. Look at the map. But the trouble is, to look at a map, you had to carry out a research project. So I actually did. I looked at the Israeli maps at the time and wrote about them. But for the population of the United States, there's no way to do that. I don't know about other countries, but as far as I can tell, they weren't published elsewhere either. This one was published, but it was in a strategic analysis journal, serious strategic analysis journal in England.
Chomsky, I'm just wondering if you would like to share some of your views on the recent changes taking place in Latin America.
That's very interesting and important.
Thank you.
And very much related to the Middle East, incidentally. Remember, the U.S. is a global power, so you can't just look at one region. You have to look at what's going on everywhere. So if we go back, say, to the last intelligence projection of the Clinton administration, National Intelligence Council, year 2000, their projection for the next 15 years, they, just keeping to energy, but there's a lot more, they took it as a matter of course that the United States would control Middle East oil. They don't discuss that much. And then they say the United States, though it will control Middle East oil, because that's a lever of world control, nevertheless, it itself will rely on what were called more stable Atlantic Basin resources, meaning West African dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the U.S. will rely on. Well, what's been going on in Latin America since then significantly threatens that. For the first time in its history, first time since the Spanish colonization, Latin America is moving towards a degree of independence and also a degree of integration. The history of Latin America is very sharply split between a tiny rich elite and huge poverty, and the rich elite, who are have been the only active ones politically, they were oriented towards the colonial power. So that's where they ship their capital. That's where they have their second wealthy homes, send their kids to school, this whole business. Very little integration internal to Latin America. I mean, even the transportation system shows that. All right, it's beginning to change. They're moving towards a degree of independence and towards a degree of integration. And the United States is terrified. Just keeping to oil alone, it means that the energy resource, the major energy producer in the hemisphere is Venezuela. The U.S. kicked the British out under Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's, it's known as Wilsonian idealism. They kicked the British out as soon as the oil age began because they knew that Venezuela had enormous oil resources. That meant supporting a bunch of utterly brutal dictators, while Venezuela became, by 1928, the leading oil exporter in the world. It's remained very high. Well, Venezuela is now going towards independence, and the United States is frantic. That's why you have this hysteria about Chavez. It's not because he's attacking anyone or anything like that. It's hysteria because he's not following orders. It's kind of like Serbia, but much more serious, because this is a big energy producer. Furthermore, it influences others. The major energy producer in South America, second to Venezuela, is Bolivia. Well, you know what just happened there. They're moving towards independence as well. And in fact, the whole region from Venezuela down to Argentina is pretty much out of control. Not totally, but pretty much. The U.S. in the past has had two fundamental mechanisms for controlling Latin America. One is violence. The other is economic strangulation. They're both weakening. The last exercise of violence was in the year 2002, when in its dedication to democracy promotion, the U.S. supported a military coup to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela. Well, had to back down, for one thing, because there was a popular uprising in Venezuela, but another reason was just the reaction in Latin America, where democracy is taken a lot more seriously than it is in in North America and Europe. And people don't think it's amusing anymore to have elected governments overthrown by a military coup. So the U.S. had to back down and turn to subversion instead, which is what's going on now. That's the last major use of violence. Incidentally, the U.S. is preparing for more use of violence. If you take a look at the number of U.S. military personnel throughout Latin America, the military bases, the training of Latin American officers, that's all going up very sharply. In fact, for the first time ever, there are now more U.S. military personnel in Latin America than personnel for the major federal aid organizations. That never happened during the Cold War. Also, military training for Latin American officers, and you know what that means. Military training is being shifted from the State Department to the Pentagon. That's important. The State Department is under congressional supervision, and there are conditionalities, human rights and democracy conditionalities. They're not imposed very much, but they're there, and they have some effect. You switch it to the Pentagon, there's no controls. Do whatever you want. And the whole region surrounded by bases, and I suspect there will be secessionist movements coming along in Venezuela and Bolivia and possibly Iran. So the military option has by no means been abandoned, but it's nothing like what it was before. I mean, in the past, you just overthrew governments, didn't think twice about it. As for the economic option, that's being lost too. The most dramatic case perhaps was Argentina. Argentina was the poster child for the IMF, and following IMF rules, it led to the worst economic disaster in its history, totally collapsed. Then violating IMF rules radically, they pulled out of it and have had rapid growth. And the international investing community and the IMF, which is a branch of the Treasury Department, couldn't do anything about it. Even the refusal to pay debt. And Argentina, in fact, the president of Argentina said, well, we're ridding ourselves of the IMF. That means of U.S. economic strangulation. And worse, he was helped in that by Venezuela, which bought a large part of the debt. Bolivia is probably doing the same, and Brazil had already done it. Well, you know, you rid yourself of the IMF, meaning the Treasury Department. That's seriously weakening the measures of economic strangulation, and it's worse. A lot of these policies are gaining significant popular appeal. I just read a scholarly paper by a very anti-Castro Cuban-American scholar who reports, I don't know where he got it from, that he said about 170,000 Latin Americans have been, in the last couple of years, have been treated in Cuban medical facilities, and most of them restoring sight under Cuban Venezuelan programs where Venezuela pays for it, and people, blind people, others who need medical care in the U.S. dependencies, where they can't get it, of course, are sent to Cuba, where they come back seeing they were blind. You know, okay, that has its effects on countries. It's called Operation Miracle. And a lot of, and within Venezuela, you know, as far as, you know, you can like it or hate it, but the interesting question is what Venezuelans think about it. Okay, well, we have good knowledge of that. There's extensive polls taken, Latin American, North American polls, and turns out that the popularity of the government has shot way up in the last, since 1998, and it now is the most popular elected government in Latin America. In fact, in the hemisphere, because this government is not popular. So it's the most popular elected government in Latin America, and it keeps going up. Well, reasons not too obscure, but sure, it's driving the United States berserk. That's why you have the constant hysteria from the government and the media about the terrible things in Venezuela and Bolivia, not just in the United States. The Financial Times, for example, which is, in my opinion, maybe the best newspaper in the world, they had an article on Morales, and the article, I wish I could quote it exactly, but it said something like how he's showing authoritarian and dictatorial and anti-democratic tendencies. What were they? Well, the first was that he nationalized Bolivian gas resources in accord with the will of 95% of the population. So that's a clear sign of an authoritarian, dictatorial, anti-democratic move. The other was that he was adopting some of Chavez's mechanisms and even support for aid for the poor and you know, social welfare and so on. Well, that really proves he's kind of a second Hitler or something. But that's a pretty consistent strain in Western reporting, and you can understand it when you have anticipated that all of this is going to remain under your control, so you don't have to worry about it, and then you begin to lose it. That's problematic. I mean, in fact, the Bush administration, you have to give them credit, has shown a certain genius in isolating the United States. They have even succeeded in alienating Canada, and that takes real talent, you know. And that's another major oil energy provider. The U.S. just refused to accept NAFTA rulings against the United States in favor of Canada. Well, you know, here, who cares? You know, kick them in the face, kick the UN in the face. That's our job. But the Canadians were not too enthusiastic about it. And the Canadian government, I don't think they're going to implement it, but they did state, Minister of Resources and others, that if the U.S. is not going to follow the rules, they will simply start to shift some of their oil exports from the United States to China, which will be perfectly happy to move in. Well, you know, as I say, that takes a certain genius. You got to admire them. Venezuela is diversifying its economy, its exports. China is very happy to move in and invest, and it's, again, the other resource exporters in South America, primarily Brazil and Chile, are increasing exports to China. Same, incidentally, is happening in the Middle East. As you may have noticed, remember when President Hu visited Washington a couple of weeks ago, the government decided to insult him by not granting him a state dinner. Well, he returned the insult very cordially by leaving from the United States and flying to Saudi Arabia. A real slap in the face to Washington, and a serious one, much more serious than a state dinner, where he firmed up relations which are already pretty strong between China and Saudi Arabia, which is China's now getting a lot of its oil from there, it's investing there, it's even giving them military aid. This is part of the deterioration of Washington's control over the major energy and other resource-rich areas. Latin America is a part of it. You got to look at it in the context of what's happening in the Middle East. It's not unrelated to the threats to invade Iran. In fact, if you look at you take a look closely at the attention given to the Iranian nuclear threat. I mean, it picks up roughly in around August 2003. That's when you start getting a lot of rhetoric about it. And then it continues to increase from then. Well, what was happening then? Take a look. What was happening then was that the U.S. had invaded Iraq. The reason was, as Bush and Blair and Powell repeatedly announced, what they called a single question. Will Saddam Hussein give up his programs of weapons of mass destruction? Well, by the summer of 2003, the question was answered the wrong way. So you had to have something new, and a new pretext came along. That's when the president announced his messianic mission to bring democracy to the world and so on. That was the real reason, weapons of mass destruction we didn't care about. It's our messianic mission to bring democracy, and everybody got on that bandwagon. But you also had to have if it turned out that Iraq is not going to be a stable, dependent client state, kind of in El Salvador, which of course is what they were hoping for. And by then it was pretty clear that's not going to happen. You're going to have some other pretexts to keep military bases there, to build the palace, which is the hugest embassy in the world, and so on, and the other indications of a permanent military presence to control it. Well, one good pretext is you got to protect the world against Iran. And in fact, as Bush's popularity rankings decline, rhetoric about the Iranian threat increases. It was actually pointed out recently in quite a good article in Al-Ahram, the Egyptian journal. But if you look, I think that's pretty accurate. The concern over the nuclear threats becomes visible at about the same time that the democracy promotion rhetoric begins. Both of them responses to the fact that the pretext for invasion had collapsed, and that it was becoming very difficult to control the country and impose a client regime as had been intended, and it increases from there. I think all of these things are related, and what's happening in Latin America is part of this picture.
Sir. PKK is the Kurdish terrorist, and they are active in North Iraq, and has been supported by the USA.
No, not the PKK. Oh, come on.
Supply, even though they had all this, the arms of the after the Vietnam that they got, and then time to time, by the Israeli forces had been trained, and Turkey lost almost 15,000, more than 15, maybe 30,000 people that in that area, and still USA is supporting, and they can't do anything. So what do you think about that?
I think that's completely false. I've been closely involved in that for years, and I think I know the facts pretty well. The U.S. is not supporting the PKK. It's strongly opposed to it. The Clinton administration particularly poured arms into Turkey. to try to support their counterinsurgency operations, which were not just against the PKK. They carried out major atrocities all throughout southeastern Turkey and the Kurdish areas. They destroyed, according to the Turkish government, about 3,500 towns and villages, wiped them out, drove out, probably millions of people. I've been there and I've seen it, and I've also seen the slums in Istanbul where the remnants try to survive. The number of people killed, nobody knows, because we don't count our own atrocities. But according to Kurdish sources, it's on the order of 50,000. That's from the mayor of Diyarbakir. Usual numbers given are 30,000. So, massive atrocities. As if you want to read, there's a lot of evidence about this. They happen to have a very good human rights specialist, Jonathan Sugden, their analyst in southeastern Turkey. He has now been kicked out by the Turkish government because he's trying to investigate what's happening. But he did compile very serious, detailed reports right through the 90s, every imaginable kind of torture, barbarism, destruction, ecological devastation, huge ethnic cleansing, one of the major atrocities of the 1990s. And so did Amnesty International, so have independent reporters and others. And in fact, in Turkey, there are plenty of people who know about this. I've taken part in Istanbul in protests by leading Turkish writers, academics, artists, journalists, and others who are courageously protesting against these atrocities, which is not easy in Turkey. It's not, Turkish jails are not much fun. But they not only protest against them, but they're constantly carrying out civil disobedience against them. I was able to participate once. And it's because they know perfectly well what's happening. Furthermore, they want it publicized. So when I was visiting Turkey, actually to take part in a trial of a publisher who was being sent to jail because he published a few remarks of mine about it, I was just invited all over the place by Turkish television because they wanted it said, and they can't say it. So it was all over the papers and television and so on. I was in fact given an award by the Turkish Publishers Association, not because I did anything particularly remarkable, but just because I was saying what they knew and can't say. As the atrocities escalated through the 90s, aid from the Clinton administration increased. In the single year, 1997, 1 year, Clinton provided more arms to the Turkish military than the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency. Well, it took a lot of discipline here in the United States for the press to shut up about this. I mean, here they're talking about, terrible atrocities going on in the Balkans by these bad Serbs and others. Meanwhile, right on the border, how can we stand it if right on the borders of NATO some terrible thing is happening? Try to find an article which said right within the borders of NATO even worse things are happening, and you're paying for it. Not just the United States, Germany involved, Britain and others, but primarily the Clinton administration. That's what was going on there. The U.S. certainly wasn't supporting the PKK. I think you're probably confusing that with U.S. support for also the Israelis for the northern Iraqi Kurds, who are strongly against the PKK. And that's for ugly geopolitical reasons. My guess is sooner or later they're going to be sold out too, as they have been in the past. Remember, the U.S. supported them in the 70s, then decided it's better to support the Shah and sold them out, and they got massacred by Saddam. That's when Henry Kissinger made his famous statement about how you shouldn't confuse foreign politics with missionary work. So yeah, we sold them out, and they get massacred by our friend Saddam. Who cares? And they're gonna, I think they're playing with fire when they rely on U.S. support. And it's very likely, almost certain, that Israel is up there in the Kurdish areas, because that's a kind of a natural alliance for them, for both of them. So that's happening, but that's not the PKK. Now, it is true that the PKK is in northern Iraq. They are there. The serious journalists who are up there, like Kevin McKiernan, and have been there for years, report that there are PKK bases in northern Iraq in the regions that are regarded as the Kurdish homeland, up in the mountains. They're there. McKiernan reports that he's been there for years, that they just move in and out with everybody else because they're more or less accepted by the Kurdish society as part of them. So they come down from their mountain strongholds and go into the towns and so on. So yeah, they're there. And the Kurds are not going to kick them out. But that doesn't, it's not to say that the U.S. supports them. The U.S. certainly hasn't, and Israel certainly hasn't. Israel's had a long, close, intimate relation with Turkey since 1958. It's, in fact, Israel's second closest alliance after the United States. And it's for good reasons. These are two of the states that are on the periphery of the oil-producing region, along with the Shah of Iran. They were what the Nixon administration called the cops on the beat, local cops on the beat, which control, which defend the tyrants who run the oil production. They defend them from their own populations. They're the kind of local gendarmes. And in that context, yes, there's a close Israeli-Turkish alliance, and it remains. Things have changed in many respects, but not in that respect. So they're the local cops on the beat. Police headquarters is in Washington. There's a branch office in London. That's roughly the way the system is run. And Turkey's been a big part of it, in alliance with Israel and, of course, the United States. So I just don't agree with the facts. I think they're the opposite, and I think they're quite ugly.
So Chomsky, my name's Aisha Tanzim. I work with the BBC World Service. Right here. I want to know, how do you see Bush administration's latest nuclear deal with India, their plans to supply nuclear technology and fuel to India?
I think there's several questions, like is it right or wrong, but I think the purpose is pretty clear. You know, we have to speculate about government policies. We're not sitting there, you know, internally and listening to the conversations, but from all the evidence available, I think it's Bush's trip to India, trying to, you know, in which he did authorize the nuclear weapons, is part of the jockeying about where India is going to go. India has a major decision to make right now as to whether it's going to become a what's called an ally, meaning kind of a client state of the United States, or whether it's going to join the emerging Asian system. And that's an extremely serious geopolitical issue. Asia is developing. It's mostly China-based, but it's got huge resources. Russia's got plenty of resources. South Korea is third biggest industrial economy in the world, I think, or very high up. China has just surpassed Japan as the major holder of foreign reserves. And between them, they hold, I think, over half of global foreign reserves. Chinese rate of growth is very fast. If you use the right measures, purchasing power parity, China already has an economy about 2/3 the size of the United States, and within about 10 years at current rates of growth, it'll be comparable to it. So, and that whole region is the most dynamic economic region in the world. They are moving, mainly China-based, to create an Asia-wide security system that includes energy resources, pipelines, development of resources, and so on. There's an Asian energy security grid, and there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is kind of paired with it more or less. They are bringing in other countries. Shanghai Cooperation Organization just brought in India, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, I think, as observers, and pretty soon they'll be admitted. Iran may give up on Europe, may decide that Europe is too easily intimidated by the United States to deal with, which may be correct, and turn to the East. The East will be very happy to accept them.
Work with. Oh.
Did I say that? Yeah, I did. That's my opinion. Yeah. It's the first paper I look at in the morning. Sorry. Actually, the business press in general is very good. Take say the Wall Street Journal. It has two. First of all, it's terrific news reporting. It also has the best comic strips in the country. what are called the editorial and opinion pages. And it's hard to beat that. You know, very good reporting and really amusing. And the